Vimana, which was this flying pyramid, or they called it a flying palace. And we'll see how that influenced rocketry right up into World War II era in Germany. This theme of Vimana was still generating imagination and curiosity and driving the rocket programs that were evolving in the 1930s. So Chang'e in China, the goddess of the moon, she had a sort of a goddess status, but she made a big mistake. She stole an elixir to give her immortality. Again, this is all these themes from Greek mythology, even Chinese mythology. She drank this elixir, which gave her immortality, and for this crime, she was banished to live on the moon and travel in space. And so they sent her off with her rabbit, U2. It's an easy one to remember. So it means you too can go to the moon. And so she was banished to fly amongst the planets. And if you look at the moon today, whereas normally in the West, we see, quote unquote, the man on the moon, the face of a man. In Chinese culture, they will frequently see the image of U2 there, the rabbit. And we'll be coming back to that again in a presentation in a couple of days about the influence of that rabbit on the evolution of Chinese space program. So the Chang'e rocket, one of the main rockets that the Chinese use in their space program, the same way the US relied on the giant Atlas rockets for the Apollo project. Chang'e is named after that goddess. And even in Japan, a similar kind of thing, where she was sent off to wander the heavens. So constantly we run into this thing about going to other places. More recently in the United States, NASA leased land from the Navajo Nation to test moon vehicles in the 1970s and 80s, and they invited Peter MacDonald, who is the chair of the Navajo Nation, or the Navajo Nation, to come out and see what they were doing since they were leasing Navajo land. And Peter brought along some of his tribal elders to watch this, and one of the elders started chuckling and sort of whispered to the NASA guy. He said, "Well, it's great you're going to the moon. We've been going there for centuries in our dreams and imagination. So when you get there, say hello to the moon men for us because, you know, we meet with them regularly." And there's another story that's part of that, but I'll tell you that at a later time, or you can ask me afterwards. So the point of this mythology is not necessarily that the myths are true, but they are evidence of this imagination and dreaming. And so let's see how that goes forward and translates into technology and space travel. So back again in Greek times, the pigeon of Archytas was this contraption built several hundred years BC. And in this, water was placed in this brass receptacle, reached the boiling point, produced steam, and then this bird, which was made out of plant materials and leather, would fly up on a string. So it was a toy, but it was a demonstration of how steam could be used. And then also, not that long later, to demonstrate this principle was this sphere that, again, water was boiled, steam came up these pipes and shot out the nozzles, and the ball was able to spin around. So again, a demonstration of the rocket principle before the Greeks really knew what the rocket principle was. And then as far as Chinese kites, which is in my presentation title, those were used strictly as a toy in the beginning. And if you see me rocking around, I really didn't have too many drinks at lunch, so it's the ship, not me. A toy, which we use today, was invented in China, or at least the first recorded evidence of kites, 500 BCE. And then also the balloon copter. And these you can buy on Amazon, I found out. You can get 200 of them for about $8. And it's a little propeller on a stick, like a straw, and when you rub it between your hands, it'll fly up in the air. So beginning to, through the use of toys, look at some of these principles that then evolved into flight and rocketry. And lastly, the Kongming lantern, which was also used. All three of these started off as just toys and amusements, and like you would use fireworks. So speaking of fireworks, perhaps one of the first people to experience with flight in this way was Wang Hengtao. Unfortunately, he survived, but he was the reason I said unfortunately is he was a prisoner of war in China. And the army in China was looking at how can you get someone up on a kite to observe enemy forces as part of your war strategy. So they took prisoners of war and launched them up on these kites. And the documentation is that Wang was the first person to actually survive this. So possibly the first hang glider of a kind. So Chinese gunpowder rockets, we're getting up to about the first millennium, AD, and they were developed out of gunpowder. And then we have 5 years later, Almer of Malmesbury, and he did this on his own. He wasn't coerced to do this. He was a monk living in England, and he decided that he was going to test flight by imitating birds, and built this contraption and leaped off the tower and survived. Broke both his legs, but he survived. So again, another little step, but thousands of years are passing here. Well, at least hundreds and hundreds between these events. Getting back to those rockets again. Now they're no longer just toys, but they're weapons of war. And the Mongolian army in the 13th century used these for warfare, not only to terrify the enemy troops with these rockets flying over, and they were gunpowder fueled, but also to start fires in the enemy camps, so they would fire these rockets over. And if you remember Star Spangled Banner in the United States and the rocket's red glare, that refers directly back in lineage to these Mongolian rockets. The Mongols used them in northern India in the 13th and 14th century. So Indian cultures knew about this technology. And when the British moved into India in the early 19th century, the first part of the 1800s, the British immediately saw that there was military value in these rockets and developed what was called the Congreve, C-O-N-G-R-E-V-E rocket. And just a few years after that was when they started using them to shell or fire rockets at Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor during the War of 1812. So the rocket's red glare refers to the rockets that were developed directly out of the Mongolian rockets from hundreds of years before that. And then moving forward, Roger Bacon was the first person to start technically describing flight. So no one had ever sort of started writing it down and figuring out how all this is going to work. Roger Bacon was doing that in England. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci and his famous ornithopter, which he never built or flew. It was a model. But again, thinking about these concepts of, well, in this case, imitating birds. That's where the ornith, if you're up on your Latin, like ornithoptery, ornithology. So again, looking at how these develop. And again, people did make attempts later on to build these. None of them were very successful. But it's a concept that was beginning to come. So we had these things develop, and then finally Wanhu strapped 47 rockets to a chair, and he figured he was going to go to the moon. He thought that might be the way to get there. And this is relatively academically documented that there was this person. He did this, and he had his accomplices light the fuses on these 47 rockets. There was an enormous explosion and cloud of smoke, and when the smoke cleared, there was no evidence of the chair or Wanhu. So obviously, it was successful. And there is a crater on the moon named Wanhu in his honor. So perhaps he made that crater, or maybe he's still up there, or maybe he talks to the Navajos too. But it's good to note here that Elon Musk's biggest rocket doesn't have as many rockets as Wanhu had. So maybe I'm going to pick a lot on Elon Musk over the next couple of days because he's an easy target. But yeah, so Wanhu may be the first astronaut. We're not sure, but he gave it a try. So he was there in spirit. Isaac Newton was the first person to start really applying mathematics to flight and rocketry with his laws of force and motion, gravitation, and propulsion. So now he's beginning to apply mathematics to this that was originally a dream. And of course, what we've all heard about actions and reactions. When you blow up a balloon and let it go and it goes spiraling off, that's a demonstration of that particular effect. So Newton then was putting math behind this. This whole process has taken thousands of years, at least high hundreds. And advances came extremely slowly until the Industrial Revolution kicked in. And for a number of reasons, things began to really pick up pace, especially in Europe. First of all, we had Montgolfier brothers. If you're a Monty Python fan, I won't explain this to the rest of you because you're not in on the joke. But Monty Python did a skit about the Montgolfier brothers. But they were the first to start really seriously experimenting with hot air balloons. And then shortly after that, there were a string of both hot air and then using hydrogen balloons. And finally, George Cayley from England began writing about the forces involved in aviation and describing some of these principles of aviation. And one of the reasons I like George Cayley, although very few people have heard of him, is that not only did he describe things that were essential to flight, but he put his life on the line and designed and flew some of these early contraptions. These were not motor-driven. They were more like a paraglider. He would sometimes have horses pull him so he could get up in the air and then cut the rope and glide for a few hundred yards. So he not only looked at the mathematics and engineering, but he built and actually flew himself in some of these. So he deserves a bit of credit. So now we're up into the mid-1800s. And things then begin to accelerate once more. Lilienthal, Henson designed fixed-wing, steam-powered model airplanes, but no person flew in them. They were small models. And then Lilienthal was the first person to actually manufacture flying devices and sell them. He started a business of designing, and this is an actual photograph from the very early 1900s of one of Lilienthal's things. He was the first person to commercially sell hang gliders. So if you had enough money, you could buy one, run down the hill, and float for a couple of 100 feet and get a thrill out of that. So this kind of activity goes back more than 100 years, 120, 130 years. People have been doing things like running down hills and floating. So Samuel Langley, again, motor-powered craft. Again, though, no one was in them. But now we're getting into history that we can begin to put in perspective with our own lives. I'm not saying any of you were born in 1896, but we're beginning to have a feeling for this history and experiencing it. In Brazil, Alberto Santos Dumont also designed flying machines, and we'll come back to him in just a second, because if you go to Brazil, they will say that he was the first person to fly, not the Wright brothers. But the Wright brothers get the credit, and I'll discuss that in just a second here. And the reason the Wright brothers get the credit, 1903 was the first powered flight with a human being on board where there was no ropes or horses pulling this contraption. So they were aloft for only 12 seconds, went a little over 100 feet, but that marked the start of it. So both of them, Wilbur and Orville, they made bicycles. That was their business. And so they went back to their shop, tinkered with it a little bit, and just a couple years later, 3 years later, they were able to fly 25 miles for 40 minutes. So huge advancement in a couple of years there. And they developed some of the technology in being able to steer this thing and have stabilizers that were brand new to technology. Getting back to Alberto, in Brazil, he flew a contraption, I guess you could call it an airplane, with a 24 horsepower engine with this strange wing design. And this is an actual photograph of him from 1906. And if you note, the design of that wing, it's a box kite design. So the same aerodynamic principles that keep a box kite aloft were also used by Santos Dumont in his aircraft. So he was experimenting with a different kind of technology. It reached a dead end. We don't see any airplanes with wings like this, but he was looking at a different perspective on this, and independently wealthy, and loved to experiment with flying. Blériot in France, 1909, this is one of the first aircraft that begins to look more like a modern airplane, with a single wing and a propeller in the front. And the main thing is, I just love this picture of him, because he just looks like he's either crazy or a genius or both. But it's just something about that photograph I find really intriguing. The kind of person you would love to sit down and have a beer with sometime. And he flew across the English Channel. So he's a person that's not usually recognized, but he was certainly a pioneer. And again, 1909, so we're pushing up now into the 20th century. And then there were a string of achievements. Lindbergh, of course, flying across the Atlantic in 1927, a huge event less than 100 years ago, in a very modern-looking aircraft. So great strides had been made. 1933, this was the first commercial, what you might call airliner, built by Boeing in 1933. And again, looking at this picture, the passengers all have their coffee or tea, and probably more legroom than you have on a lot of commercial flights these days. Still very small. Maybe they carried 10 or 12 passengers. But again, this is beginning to look very modern as we get into 1933. The Heinkel 178, the first turbojet. 1939, we had jets in 1939. They were not commercially produced, but people were building them and flying them. World War II came along, and we'll get back to World War I and World War II in just a second. 1947, Charles, also known as Chuck Yeager, broke the sound barrier in 1947. For perspective, I was born in 48. So This is getting up into modern times, but the speed of this acceleration of flight was astronomical from 1903 to 1947. So here we have the Wright brothers flying for just a matter of a few seconds in 1903, and 44 years later breaking the sound barrier. So huge advances. And now we'll talk about the reasons why some of that happened. Getting back to Tsiolkovsky again, who's considered the father, or the Russian father of rocketry, was another one of these geniuses, self-taught. He was essentially deaf, very poor, hung out at the library near Moscow, had good tutors, and studied mathematics, and started to think about and imagine what it would be like to travel in space, and document it and write it down. And he was the first person to describe orbits and how you might launch things that would go into orbits. Develop the rocket formula, which is still used to determine how much fuel you need to reach a certain speed with a certain mass rocket. The rocket formula is still used. It was developed by him. Rocket trains, multi-stage, he called them rocket trains. Now we call them multi-stage rockets, where one rocket burns off and drops off, and then another rocket ignites and sends it even higher into the atmosphere. The concept of space elevators, which I'll talk about subsequent presentation, and spacesuits. He was the first one to come think, well, if you go up into space, you're going to need some kind of protection for your body, a spacesuit. Satellites and solar energy. And this concept of Russian cosmism, which I'll be coming back to again when I talk about the arts, in briefest terms, Russian cosmism was a belief that Tsiolkovsky shared with many others that again, this was going into the Soviet period where religion was not so much favored as it might have been. It was more atheistic at that point. So Tsiolkovsky and others had this philosophy that humans could be resurrected from the dead, not through theological means, but through technology. And so he was a firm believer that at some point technology would be able to resurrect all dead humans on Earth and make them immortal. Well, there's only one problem with that. There's lots of problems with that, but one of them was that the Earth would become extremely crowded. So one of his motivations for rockets was what you do with all these people after you've resurrected them. Well, you seed the universe through rocketry. So he was developing technology to fulfill his philosophy that arose out of this concept of cosmism. So it's an interesting concept of how that came. And he started founding this rocketry clubs in Russia, the Society for Interplanetary Travel, in 1924. So these were private clubs like you would have a model airplane club. They had no government funding. The government was not at all interested in it. He was also a great science fiction writer. His books are really pretty poor as far as science fiction goes, but it allowed him to develop some of his ideas about space travel in the context of science fiction. He could speculate, he could dream. He didn't have to use mathematics in a science fiction book. He could talk about how you would build a spacesuit, for example, through science fiction. It gave him a step up to explore his ideas a little farther. And late 19th century, he had this drawing of a spaceship. So this was around, I believe, like 1890, something like that. And if you look a little closer at this, if you blow it up, and you start to notice some of the things going on there that look extremely modern for that period, including what looks like bathtubs. So the question is, why would you want bathtubs on a spaceship? Well, he knew that acceleration would be tremendous during a takeoff. And one of the ways that you could cushion, that he was speculating, cushion that effect on the human body would be if you could be suspended in water, then that would cushion that acceleration. So, like I said, he also wrote science fiction, and he participated in development of one of these movies, Cosmic Journey, a Soviet-era science fiction movie. And I'm going to show a very brief clip from it. And in this movie, you can see the use of his bathtubs, although now they're vertical instead of horizontal. And I'm not going to tell you how it ends. You'll have to. But I think you can even track this down on YouTube. I think the whole thing is on YouTube. So, Cosmic Journey, 1936. But it was again, developing these concepts of proceeding forward in space. So let's talk a little bit here about the impact of warfare. First World War. As you know, these kinds of airplanes, and you've seen images like this before, and I'm sorry if I'm standing in your way, I'll try to move out. First air-to-air combat, certainly more efficient aircraft. The government was now taking an interest in aircraft suddenly. They got hit alongside the head and said, oh, I guess there's some future for aircraft for national defense. And they could go 125 miles an hour. Air power was critical, and developed mass production, again, through the Industrial Revolution and those processes. And, very importantly, public exposure to aircraft. The public really hadn't seen airplanes before this. And, of course, one way to be exposed is to be bombed by them, which is not necessarily a great way introduction. But it became part of the national expectation that aircraft were a real thing. They really did fly. It wasn't just a dream, because people didn't turn on a television and watch the news. Maybe they saw films in a movie theater, but that would be about it. So one of the things interesting here that I find really curious, in 1914, so just before World War I was really getting underway, the number of fixed-wing aircraft in the U.S. was 6. We had 6 airplanes. And when I say we, it's because I'm from the United States, so I apologize to those of you who are not. The reason for that was that the Wright brothers, geniuses that they were in designing this thing, were also businessmen, and they held on to their patents because they wanted to tinker and refine their flying machine. And they held on to this for a decade. They held on to those patents. They wouldn't let competing aircraft developers in the United States use their technology, their patents. So that's why the U.S. had so few aircraft, because only the Wright brothers could make them, and they just had a little shop and weren't really interested in mass production. As soon as the war broke out, the United States realized, we got to get our act together on this. So they coerced the Wright brothers into releasing the patents, and others started producing them. So just 4 years later, this is how many aircraft were around. Many of them were lost during the war, but a huge generation of interest in flying. And of course, after the war, there were all these airplanes that could do all kinds of good things. So let's take a look now into rocketry. Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry, Goddard Space Flight Center, which is right outside Washington, D.C., is named after him. That's him second from the right. And he developed liquid-fueled rockets, multi-stage, which was a big breakthrough in the United States. And in Germany, where all kinds of things were happening in the 1930s, Hermann Oberth is considered the German father of rocketry and wrote a book, The Rocket into Planetary Space. It's very technical. So a friend of his named Max Valier got together and made the book, popularized the book, made it accessible to the general public. And so it generated a lot of interest in Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s in rocketry. Again, still the government didn't take any interest in it. And Max Valier also developed, it's hard to see, but there are flames shooting out of the back of his vehicle there. He had a rocket car and blew himself up in that. But again, it's interesting how this recreational aspects of rocketry, as far as the serious business of rockets, gets into play here. So in Germany, there was another society for rocketry. And again, these were like model airplane clubs. They were independent, and they began to experiment with different kinds of rockets. 1931, so we're getting up to an interesting point in German history here. But what influenced Obert and his dreams of space travel? And he wrote about this and spoke about this frequently. 2 books. Jules Verne, first of all, influenced him, and he also was a firm believer that this was potentially true, this flying structure in India. This, again, was a period in history when occultism was sort of on the rise, and people were interested in mythologies from the past as being reality. So both of those influenced Obert. So the 3 fathers of modern rocketry, Tsiolkovsky in Russia and the Soviet Union, Goddard in the US, Obert in Germany. And then also Sergei Korolev in more modern times in Russia. And in 1957, developed the R-7 missile. We'll come back to that in just a second. But again, the government still was not putting any money behind this, considering, well, they're just dreamers. And one of Obert's students was Werner von Braun, who you may have heard of, active in German rocketry clubs. And Obert and von Braun went off in World War II. Von Braun was portrayed in the 1950s as being coerced by the German government. That's not really true. He independently joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and was an officer in the SS. So the development of rockets was heavily dependent on use of slave labor, and von Braun was complicit in that, but he was also a brilliant person in developing rockets. And the development of the V2 rocket, which is now we're really beginning to see what these rockets look like. It looks like a modern rocket, and it included a lot of technology that was very important. So during World War II, V2 rockets were fired from France and Germany into Belgium and London and caused a huge amount of damage. The first use of more modern rockets for warfare. And these things were massive. You can see the, I don't know if this pointer will get there. Yeah, well, it's hard to see. But you can see the fellow on the top of the ladder on the right rocket there is to give it some scale. These were monstrous vehicles. They used alcohol and water for fuel, oxygen. And look at some of these statistics. They had a range of 200 miles and could go 3,500 miles an hour. So these were serious rockets. And at the end of World War II, through a program called Operation Paperclip, the United States rushed into Germany in the late part of the war and gathered up this technology and as many of those V2 rockets as they could to take back to the US. And at the same time, the Soviets were coming in from the east and grabbing up rockets and people too. And the United States were gathered up. Also, Obert and von Braun made them a deal they couldn't turn down, brought them back to the United States, and began to develop the American rocket program. And some of these pictures may start to look familiar because von Braun wrote about and designed these space stations, drawings, and collaborated with Walt Disney in the 1950s to popularize rocketry. Again, this was highly supported by the American government because the Cold War was beginning to brew. And they knew that by bringing the public along through Walt Disney and his impact on people like me when I was 7 and 8 and 9 years old, was a good way to develop public support for a rocketry program that would eventually go head-to-head with the Soviet Union. So that was the impetus behind this. So I still remember I had a copy of this, and I wish I still had it. 1955, and if you were around watching Walt Disney in the 1950s, you might have remembered a whole series of Walt Disney productions about outer space and its potential. So then, everything changed. October 4th, Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and the space race was off and running. It was designed as a show of that the Soviet Union was superior in space. They were the first people to do it, the first nation to do it, and when it flew over the United States, I remember again, I was 9 years old at the time, and running outside with binoculars when my little friends down the street would call up and say, hey, Sputnik's going over. So you'd go out and try to see it. So it was quite an achievement, and it started the space race. That was really sort of a marker for the beginning of that period in space. Very soon after that, just 4 months later, the US launched its own rocket into space. And you'll see this is a forward and back race that actually was going on. 1961, Yuri Gagarin, not only the first human in space, but the first person to orbit the Earth. And 1 month later, Alan Shepard, the first American in space. He did not orbit. He did go up into space and came back down. But again, it was quite an achievement. And then, of course, John Glenn's flight in 1962, the first American to orbit the Earth. So you can see this back and forth horse race between the Soviet Union and the United States at this point. John F. Kennedy made his famous what's called the Moon speech in September of that year, where he pledged that the United States would be able to land a human on the moon and bring them safely back by the end of the decade, which happened. Valentina Tereshkova, again, the first woman in space, and she not only went up into space in '63, but she spent 3 days there, which was a huge accomplishment, and did multiple orbits. And of course, the space race ended, by most accounts, in 1969 with the Apollo 11 moon landing. At that point, the Soviet Union was beginning to run into financial troubles trying to keep this up. So it was mainly as much of a financial, economic, rather than technological setback for the Soviet Union. So they dropped back. And so that's considered sort of the end of it. Just pushing very briefly forward in this, a series of some orbiting space stations. Some of these names you may remember, like Skylab and Mir. International Space Station, which of course is still up and running. In China, the Chinese father of space. And he was working away at Caltech and was deported because there was suspicion he might have been a communist. So he was deported to China and founded his space program there, which ended up with the Long March rockets and Tiangong, the Chinese, one of the early Chinese space stations. And in India, the father of Indian space program. And something interesting about India, they were not so much interested in going to Mars. or going to the moon or outer space, but to take that technology and look back on Earth and use it for agriculture, weather, production, those kinds of things. And so again, to complete the circle, it all begins with dreams. And again, getting back to Robert Goddard and his quote, "The dream of yesterday, the hope of today, and the reality of tomorrow." And we'll end with this picture of a space elevator, which I'd be happy to discuss with you, a theory of how to get into space. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And tomorrow we'll talk about the search for extraterrestrial life.